Hi everyone, hope you all had a lovely afternoon tea or time zone appropriate other break. We have next up here, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong place in the screen. We have next up here DawnE.Collett, talking about Upstream Accessibility, a Contributor's Guide. Dawn likes to tinker with cloud infrastructure and security, and regularly goes down rabbit holes in a futile search for ways to develop systems that are both reliable and impenetrable. As well as accidental accessibility advocacy, Dawn can regularly be found sharing knowledge within the Melbourne cloud infrastructure and DevOps communities. Outside work, Dawn is an occasional author, kitchen alchemist, and raging sports ball fan. So Dawn's talk is a pre-recorded talk. There won't be time for live questions after, but Dawn will be in the chat chatting away with you. So please ask Dawn all of your questions in the chat. All right, we're ready to go. Roll it, Chris.
Hello everyone, it is really good to be back here again at Linux Conference Australia, once again from the comfort of our own homes. And I am here this year to talk about accessibility, specifically accessibility in the upstream of open source software. If that doesn't make sense to you yet, don't worry, because my aim by the end of this talk is to have laid out a contributor's guide, if you will, for the idea of upstreaming accessibility in open source software. If you want to follow along with the sources that I used to put together this talk, you can go to the link in the slide that's up at the moment, or you can scan the QR code with your phone, and it will bring you to a GitHub repository with a list of all the sources that I used when putting this talk together. To begin with, I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, on whose land this talk was recorded. This is and always will be Aboriginal land. Their sovereignty was never ceded. I'm sure that most of you have probably met me or encountered me in the wild by now. But for those of you who haven't, we're going to do a bit of an atypical introduction again. Last year at Linux Conference Australia, when I gave my talk on the privacy tax, which was about privacy and data security in a world of tracking and hacking with regards to disability, I had an artificial intelligence introduce me. This time, I want to introduce myself in terms of the way that I get around the world. Pertinent piece of information to understand here, I don't have a driver's license, so that means that I have a few different options for navigating my way around the world. I can find someone who has both a car and a driver's license and ask them to take me from point A to point B. I can get on public transport. I can go out and I can get myself a taxi or use some sort of ride-sharing app to get myself from point A to point B. Or I can walk. Some of these options have various benefits and downsides. Being driven by other people is a wonderful thing, but I am not always going to be able to find people who have a car, a driver's license, and the time to get me from point A to point B. Using taxis and or ride-sharing apps costs a lot of time and money and sometimes is a really big faff. Walking is very practical, but as you probably all know by now, I'm quite limited in my ability to walk, and you can't really walk long distances anyway. So what this means in practice is that the way that I tend to get around the world involves a lot of use of Melbourne's public transport system. Melbourne's public transport system, at least in metropolitan Melbourne, is made up of three different forms of transport largely: trains, trams, and buses. Forget about the buses. Let's talk about the trams and the trains. And I want to start here by talking about the trams. Because if I want to get from point A to point B on a tram, there are quite a number of logistical hurdles to me actually doing that. The Victorian government's auditor has actually done an audit recently on the accessibility of the Yarra Trams fleet and Yarra Tram stops. And what they found is that only about half of the tram routes that run in Melbourne have low-floor accessible trams running on them at all. And none of those routes have low-floor trams running 100% of the time. Now, the chief importance here being that the higher floor trams actually require you to get upstairs to be able to get on them. So if you're a wheelchair user, essentially you cannot use high floor trams unless you somehow manage to crawl yourself in the wheelchair up the stairs. But it's not just the tram fleet that presents a logistical barrier to myself and other disabled people actually using the services of Yarra trams. It's also the fact that in order to be able to safely get on a tram if you are a wheelchair user, even if it's a low floor tram, you need to actually be able to get on at a stop that is accessible where the curbside of the stop meets the doors of the tram. And again, even on the routes where the vast majority of trams that are run are accessible low floor trams, only one route, the number 96, comes close to 100% of its tram stops being accessible. The rest, even the ones that quite a number of low floor trams run on, hover between sort of 50 and 60%. Some have basically no accessible stops at all. So to illustrate this, let's go for a walk through the Melbourne CBD and have a look at some of the public transport options that I would have if I wanted to get from point A to point B on a tram.
So it is currently approximately 9 o'clock in Melbourne on the 28th of December, and I have just got off a Route 86 tram at the Burke Street Mall Elizabeth Street stop. And I want to do a little tour of all of the tram stops going down to where my office currently is to actually prove this point about accessibility. Then we have a crossing here that is coming up ahead. And if I turn the phone very slightly to the left, accessible tram stop. So you can see along these routes that some of the tram stops are actually accessible. But if we head a little bit further down, something which you can't see but is visually apparent to me is there is a tram at the moment pulling up to the accessible tram stop, which is a high floor tram that has got stairs coming up to it. So what we have there is the problem of the stop is accessible, but the tram that's running along it is actually not. So we're now approaching Collins Street. They're cross between Collins Street and Elizabeth Street. So actually crossing over the road, if I tilt this to the right, you can see again accessible trams. And that's Collins Street, Elizabeth Street. But again, it had one of the non-accessible trams there. So they run 11, 12, 48 and 109 along there. And part of the problem is not all of those trams are actually accessible. This is going to require me to make 2 crossings to actually show this to you. And you can see here again, that there is a low floor tram. I'm waiting to be able to cross. So this area around Plymouth Street and Elizabeth Street, this was just redone at a not small expense. But as you can see, as I'm walking along here, they didn't actually think to redo the tram stop. So this entire tram stop is at ground level. And if I approach the Route 19 tram head, which is actually a beautiful illustration of how this works, you can see the doors don't meet the ground.
So as you can see, that's not super ideal. There are certain areas of Melbourne, if you want to get from point A to point B by tram, that are exceptionally accessible, very easy for wheelchair users to just roll themselves on and roll themselves off. Pretty easy for the vast majority of other people with physical disabilities to get on and get off as well. But there are tram stops, like the one at the corner of Flinders and Elizabeth Street, which, even though there is ample space to make the tram stop itself accessible, and even though a very large amount of money was just spent renovating that precinct, nothing was actually done to make the tram stop accessible, and they don't run low floor trams along there. Now, the audit report actually pointed out that Yarra trams used to have an exemption from, or a waiver around the accessibility legislation in Victoria. That actually expired in September of last year. The new target was supposed to be for them to make the vast majority of tram fleets accessible by September of 2022, and probably surprising nobody who's had any dealings with government, they're not going to meet that deadline either. The auditor also pointed out that this actually puts them at risk of being sued or taken to tribunal for offering inaccessible services. So then we have to look at metro trains, because on the surface, metro trains actually seems like a much better option if you want to take public transport around Melbourne. All of Melbourne's trains, at least the ones that run on the metropolitan lines, are accessible. They're all low floor. You can get in and get out of them fairly readily. Kind of. Because the issue that you run into with metro trains is that they have the same sort of problem that the trams do, in that in a lot of cases, the floor of the train does not actually meet the edge of the tram stop, the edge of the train platform. And so in order to get on, if you're me or if you're a wheelchair user or someone who has some sort of other mobility impairment, you're actually reliant in a lot of cases on the driver coming out and getting a ramp for you so that you can then wheel yourself on and off. And as the many, many complaint letters that I have sent to metro trains can attest, and as the many, many very polite letters that I've got back from their complaints department can also attest, that doesn't always work out quite so well as you might think.
So this is a train sitting on a platform at Flinders Street Station. If you look at the doors of the train that are open, you can actually see not only is there a gap between the train and the platform that's quite significant, but there's also a height differential. And that means that if you're in a wheelchair or you have trouble lifting your knees, it's going to be really hard, if not impossible, to get yourself on. This has been fixed to an extent by raising the platforms at one end of the platform where the driver usually comes in so that people can roll themselves on. But that hasn't been done on every train platform at every station. And the other issue with that is even then, there's only the one position that you can get on the train. You still have to get yourself off and all the way down the platform to be able to safely get on the train without assistance.
There's a salient point here that I want to illustrate, which is around the nature of accessibility, the nature of adaptability and assistance, and what these actually look like. Now, this is important because in some cases, even though the Yarra Trams network actually looks less accessible, in some cases the Yarra Trams network is actually the better option if you're physically disabled and you want to get from point A to point B, because you don't actually need help from any individual person. There's no single point of failure. You can get yourself on and get yourself off because the infrastructure has been built in such a way to allow you to do that. Essentially, rather than you having to ask people for assistance, the infrastructure has adapted. It's help without the handshake. It's help that comes in the form of the way that we've built up society, rather than help that relies on individual people, goodwill, and single points of failure. This sort of analogy is applicable to many, many other aspects of life as well. So something that's important to think about here then is the idea of public utilities. Metro trains and Yarra trams, even though they're technically privatised, are public utilities. They're available for anyone in the public to use on the assumption that they pay some sort of fee. In fact, a modern world without public utilities wouldn't really be a modern world at all. A lot of the things that we're able to do day to day, a lot of the structures of modern daily life are actually very much built around these public utilities and public supports that we as a society have been able to put together to function interconnected, but without needing to ask for help from any specific individual. And there are a lot of different aspects of the world around us that we could consider in some ways to be public utilities, in the sense that regardless of whether one has to pay a fee, they are used by a very large percentage of the public in their day-to-day lives. We can look at things like water, electricity, public transport. But we can also look at things which are much more relevant day-to-day to our careers in technology. We can actually look at the internet and computers and the whole interconnected framework of the World Wide Web as being part of a public utility. You know, anyone can effectively just walk into other people's public websites and see what's up there and see what's going on there. And that sort of thinking has been brought to the forefront of consciousness in the United States of America recently by the country's favorite pastime of lawsuits. Specifically, I want to call out the Robles versus Domino's Pizza LLC lawsuit, which has been wending its way through the courts for several years at this point. I believe it was actually filed in 2019, and it was settled earlier this year. Essentially what happened was Guillermo Robles, a blind screen reader user, wanted to order himself a pizza. And he chose to do this not by going down to his local Domino's pizza outlet, but by doing so online. Unfortunately, what he found was that he wasn't actually able to navigate Domino's website using his screen reader. After some attempts to resolve this, he followed the time-honored American tradition of having to sue for your rights and sued Domino's Pizza. The consequence of this, after it went through several layers of the courts, an appeal to the Supreme Court, which ultimately sided with Robles, and then a second judgment in the lower court, which sided with Robles and agreed that Domino's Pizza needed to remediate the issues with their website. The ultimate consequence of this is that, in the US at least, the World Wide Web and public websites are moving towards being defined as a place of public accommodation as part of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this means that if you are legally required to have your brick and mortar stores accessible to all of the public, not just those members of the public without disabilities, you are also required to do the same with your online shopping website, to do the same with your corporate website, to provide equal access to people with disabilities, regardless of the type of disability that they may have, so that they can consume your content, interface with your services, or purchase your goods. So that's America. Let's take a little trip across the pond. I don't know what percentage of the audience today has ever lived in or been to England, Wales, Scotland, or Northern Ireland, the constituent countries of the United Kingdom. But the United Kingdom actually has a really, really good situation which will allow us to illustrate some of this idea of websites as public utilities. For all of the massive problems with the UK's government that have become apparent probably well before my lifetime and have been continuing to become apparent for the entire time that I have been around, one thing that the UK does really well is accessibility on their government websites, essentially the .gov.uk sites. And information on .gov.uk sites massively varies from the much satirised preparing with emergencies.gov.uk to Her Majesty's Internal Revenue Service, to various parliamentary websites, to general information on how to access various aspects of the country. And the .gov.uk websites as a whole have the incredible achievement of probably actually being one of the most accessible top-level domains on the web. And the reason why this is really interesting is because, by and large, UK government websites are all built almost entirely with raw HTML and CSS. The reason why they're built that way is actually for accessibility purposes. The idea is that if the government is not building with frameworks, if the government and people building government websites build with raw HTML and CSS and have a consistent set of standards that they have to follow, it's vastly more likely that the websites that they produce actually will be accessible to anybody who needs to go to them. Particularly now with HTML5, that a lot of features around accessibility are inherently built into HTML itself. And this is a strategy that's actually worked really well. Having UK government software developers follow this strategy has, according to several surveys, resulted in the .gov.uk TLD being one of the most accessible in the world. The problem is that the modern web is not the .gov.uk TLD. The modern web is built almost entirely these days on frameworks. And whilst there are very good reasons for the UK government choosing to build the vast majority of their websites in raw HTML and CSS, there are also very good reasons why the modern web is built up the way that it is. Because there's no point in everybody reinventing the wheel. There's no point in everybody writing their code in raw HTML when we can simply build frameworks and component libraries which will allow us to reuse other people's code and get on with the business of building the websites that we actually want to build. This ethos has made web development vastly more accessible in terms of people actually being able to produce websites. If you look at a lot of the modern low-code platforms out there, pretty well anyone can knock up a website in not too much time and actually put it on the web so that anyone is able to interface with their content, anyone is able to purchase their goods, and anyone is able to understand the services that they may provide. The trade-off with that is that if your framework is not accessible, your website is not necessarily accessible either. The WebAIM study has consistently found that websites using frameworks are more likely to have accessibility issues that are picked up by automatic checkers, and that they also have more accessibility issues that are picked up through automated checkers. Ruby on Rails is one of the better frameworks out there for this, and some of the JavaScript-based frameworks are very much the worst offenders, as you can see from this chart. But it's true across the board that there are not really any frameworks out there that actually reduce your chance of having accessibility errors on the website that you're building. And there are a few things to look at here around what actually makes a framework or a component library or some sort of reusable setup accessible. Full credit here to Jess Budd, an accessibility specialist from Perth, Western Australia, who I met at a conference in Adelaide in 2019. She gave a talk there talking about how React accessibility wasn't that hard from her point of view. And at the end of the talk, I challenged her on this. I actually said, in my view as a disabled person, the best kind of framework is a framework where people don't have to think about building accessibility into it. And the fact that people have to think about building accessibility into React in some ways actually means that maybe it is that hard. We had a very, very long and productive discussion after her talk, and in some ways, as I've seen more of modern web development build up and I've had more discussions with people about how it works, I'm actually sort of coming around to her point of view on this, that sometimes with regards to accessibility, you don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. The problem with that, though, is that some of these frameworks are designed so that anyone who deals with websites should be able to spin it up themselves, and they're not necessarily going to know what they need to do to make it accessible. So to boil it down into a few points, the first thing that makes a framework or a component or any sort of reusable widget that you can plug into some sort of framework to build or some sort of programming language to build a website is that it's easy to do. And that might mean that there is some manual intervention that still has to happen, but it should be manual intervention that's clearly documented and easily explained to anyone without a lot of coding experience. The second and perhaps more obvious aspect is there should be no errors that mean that you have to actually rewrite bits of the component or bits of the framework. If you're building something reusable that has accessibility errors inherently baked in, at that point it kind of defeats the purpose if you have to go and write another framework over it to actually make it accessible. The third aspect around what makes a framework accessible is ease of use of accessibility features. And something that's really interesting to call out here is Tailwind CSS, and specifically the Tailwind UI components that they release, rely on a bunch of free icons and free, essentially, component libraries that are fully accessible. The issue that you may run into, and this is part of where the nuance here is around the difference between something that's actually built in a way that hinders accessibility and something that's just not built to make it easy. Frameworks like your React, Vues, Angular's, Ruby on Rails tend to fall more into the former bucket, that they're just not built to make it easy. Whereas if a component library is bad, it's usually really bad, and often that's around actual accessibility errors being baked in. Speaking of accessibility errors, some of the accessibility errors that you might run into around component libraries are not the types of things that you might think of off the top of your head. They're also not the types of things that are necessarily going to be picked up by automatic checkers. And I can illustrate this by using the just use dark mode, it'll be fine principle. These are two logos of the Chicago Blackhawks of the National Hockey League. These were pulled off the website for Cap Friendly, which is a website that lists essentially details around contracts of hockey players who play in the National Hockey League. And I'm sure that most of you can probably see the problem with this fairly readily. Poor Blackhawk there doesn't quite function on light mode. He's missing not just his eyes, but some of the paint on his face. Of course, this can essentially be solved by saying just use dark mode, it'll be fine. But if at that point you've actually built an entire website and you've set it up with both light mode and dark mode, which the people who run Cap Friendly probably haven't at this point if they've got this error, you would be a bit narked if you discovered that the images that you were using had transparent bits that essentially just disappeared depending on the color of your background. And that kind of thing is a real issue because it can't be picked up by automatic checkers, and you might start with a component library that looks perfectly fine, and then as you're adding more and more accessibility features, things like actually theming your site, some of the more advanced features that help people, particularly with visual differences, then 6 months down the line, you actually discover that the component library that you're using isn't accessible at all because it works with one of light or dark mode and not both. And I'm sure that the vast majority of you here would not be surprised by what I'm about to say, but something that's really important to consider here is careful choice of frameworks when you interact with the web and when you are building websites is important, and it is your responsibility to look into it, to do this research, not to find things that are perfect, but to find frameworks that are going to help you do this work rather than hinder it. So that was a whole lot of discussion around public infrastructure and around the basics of what makes an accessible framework. But the reality is nobody's perfect, right? Not every framework is going to be entirely accessible out of the box. So there's an important discussion here to have if you are using open source frameworks, if you are building within an open source ecosystem. about how we can contribute back to public infrastructure, about how we can actually build around public infrastructure to make it more accessible to the people that use it. And this, to me, is where the concept of upstream accessibility comes in. There's no point in having 50 or 100 or 1,000 or 100,000 different web developers make the same change to a framework or to a component library or to some other piece of reusable code to make it accessible on their website. It is vastly preferable for all of us if we can find ways to build this into the framework at its core, to make it easier for people to use and to make it more readily accessible so that we don't have to have everyone essentially reinventing the wheel in many, many different ways. But the thing about upstream accessibility that makes this kind of interesting is it requires becoming part of the open source ecosystem, and it requires actually working out a way to have a lot of these discussions around accessibility and to push for people to take their frameworks and improve them. And a key component of this is that if you can do some of the work for people, that will often show them the path to be able to do the rest. So you're sitting down, you're coding a website, and you discover that maybe the component library that you're using has an outright accessibility error in it. Or you're looking at different component libraries and there's one that would be absolutely perfect for what you want to do, but it requires you to use a web framework that doesn't really make accessibility easy for you. At this point, you're at the finding issues stage. And there are several different ways to deal with these sorts of discoveries, with varying chances of success. In some cases, you can just percolate what you've discovered up to the maintainers of the Upstream package and say, hey, this is an issue around accessibility. If they're very switched on, if they're very active in making sure that they do know what's going on and that what they build is accessible, it's very likely that those changes are going to be made really quickly. On the other hand, you might find that you're dealing with people who've never really interacted with the concept of accessibility at all. Or you might find that you're dealing with people who just don't understand it. And so once you've found an issue, then there's the question of when to upstream. And when I originally proposed this talk, I thought that I was going to be giving a very different roadmap for how to deal with upstream accessibility. What changed my mind on this was a blog post by Sherry Byrne-Haber, who is one of the luminaries of modern accessibility, particularly modern web accessibility, talking about how not to be an accessibility Grinch, which is very appropriate given that it's just gone Christmas and New Year. And one of the things that she actually talks about in that blog post, which completely changed my thinking on this, is that you can't just take accessibility at a point in time. Part of maintaining accessible websites, accessible frameworks, accessible component libraries, accessible, reusable anything, is about being able to constantly evaluate your accessibility posture. It's about having, if not an extremely deep, at least deeper than surface level understanding of what you need to do to make all of these things work. And so when it comes to the question of when to upstream accessibility, the fundamental question that you have to ask yourself is, am I dealing here with a group of people who look like they're going to be receptive to this? And how much time am I willing to put in on fixes to make sure that these issues are remediated? And these are all questions that you've got to consider when you think about when to upstream accessibility fixes. There are scenarios where it's just better to walk away. There are scenarios where it's better to actually find the most accessible option off the shelf and not worry about trying to make these improvements. But if you have the time and the wherewithal, and you have maintainers who are very receptive to this, upstreaming accessibility can have massive benefits in the sense that it can make reusable things that many people are using and hopefully keeping up to date much, much better in terms of experience for disabled users of the web. The other thing that's very important to understand when you're thinking about when to upstream accessibility issues is the difference between a framework or component issue and a site level issue. Sometimes there will be things that you want to build that are very specific, things that you want to build that need to be accessible. But if those go into an upstream framework, it may just add complexity that most people don't need. If the core features of that framework are accessible as is, it may not actually benefit people to build accessibility directly in for edge cases where you're building on top of the framework, because it will potentially add more bloat. We'll get onto that a bit later. What we're talking about, though, in terms of the really good candidates for upstreaming accessibility are where you've got framework level issues. So where you can either identify improvements that can be made to the framework that reduce the amount of manual work that people need to do to make things accessible, or where you can identify outright errors in the framework that need to be remediated for it to be accessible. So that's what you're essentially looking at. There's a bit of nuance in the difference between a framework level issue and a site level issue. But in general, you can assume that if you're building something on top of the framework and you need to do work to make it accessible, it's probably on you. Whereas if you're using something out of the box in a framework and you find yourself having to build around it or rewrite it, it's probably on them. And the human aspect is really important to understand. As I alluded to earlier, it's going to be a very different scenario when you're dealing with maintainers who are very understanding of this, or maintainers who don't know much but are willing to learn, compared to when you're dealing with maintainers who don't particularly care. But there are things that you can do to make this easier as well in the process of upstreaming accessibility. You can talk to the maintainers about how the project is set up. If you're pushing in upstream fixes and you don't intend to be involved over the long term, make it as easy as possible for the maintainers to actually merge those fixes in. So that means following the code of conduct, following the contributing guidelines, doing any testing that's requested, and also showing your work in terms of what you've done, what it resolves, and how it actually improves the framework or component or reusable thing. And this brings us to the concept of implementation and testing. The sort of piece around implementing fixes is not one that I'm going to talk to very much, and that is for the one very simple reason that I am not a web developer. This is not what I do in my day-to-day job. I can explain to you how all of this works. I can explain to you how I think it can be done well, but I cannot explain to you how to remediate the problems. That's also going to vary vastly depending on what sort of framework you're using, what sort of language it interfaces with, and the specific type of reusable thing that you actually want to uplift. So as far as implementing fixes, my recommendations would be that you understand what accessibility issues are, that you test your fixes for accessibility issues, and that you discuss that with other people who are knowledgeable in the language or framework that you're working on to make sure that it would be an appropriate fix and that it's also well implemented. My friend Katie has inspired many aspects of this talk and is very, very passionate about accessibility. But one thing that I always really enjoy about working with Katie is at the end of it, I come out with much better code than I would have had if only my eyes were on it. The bit which is a bit easier to do from a sort of run book is the accessibility testing piece. Because presumably, and well, that's not always the case, but presumably if you're here at the point of wanting to upstream accessibility improvements, you've identified that the accessibility issue is there. And so testing in that sense is fairly straightforward because it's about a few things. First of all, being able to demonstrate that the issue existed originally and was repeatable. Sometimes you can do that with automated accessibility checkers, sometimes you can't. Automated accessibility checkers are only really half the story. It's about being able to verify that the accessibility issue is gone once you have fixed it. And it's about being able to verify that you've not made any other accessibility issues worse, and that you can otherwise test and appropriately document the code. Some of that, as I said, can be done with automated checkers. Sometimes it will require you to manually change things. It will require you to zoom your screen in and out. It will require you to use a screen reader. Sometimes it will require you to actually view things with sounds off. There are many, many different things that you may have to do to be able to do appropriate accessibility testing. The other important piece here is what you as a maintainer need to know about upstream accessibility. Because if you're building your own system, you need to have, again, a bit better than surface level knowledge of what's going on with accessibility if you want it to actually be accessible. And that's about things like understanding the automated checkers that are out there. It's about things like understanding what you can't pick up with automated checkers and you'll need to test for manually. It's really, really easy for things to disappear into the ether if you don't know what it is that you're looking for. Even if they were accessible at one point, people can make changes that might not be picked up by any automated checking. And so some of that as well is if someone's come to you and said, hey, I'm upstreaming some accessibility fixes, it's about understanding what you need to do to keep the code base accessible. And if you're taking external pull requests, understanding what you need to convey to people to make sure that the code that they're putting in is accessible. And as I said, automation is only half the answer. AI is not good enough yet that we can get it to do accessibility for us. There are some accessibility issues that have to be tested for and remediated manually. And then there's the matter of actually releasing fixes, which is probably the easy bit, because at this point, if you've pull requested it following all of the guidelines and it's been reviewed, then it will hopefully be released by the maintainers. And from there you can look to either helping them to continue to uplift it, going and building what you were trying to build originally, or looking for other places where you can upstream these accessibility fixes. I do want to briefly come back to the point that I made earlier around the ease of use of a lot of these frameworks. Because one thing to me that kind of hinders the web being accessible as a public utility in the same way as metro trains or Yarra trams is the fact that there's a big knowledge gap. So a lot of people don't actually understand what needs to be done to make websites accessible. And in some ways, frameworks have made this worse because people just take things off the shelf and build with it without actually understanding that there's more work that they need to do. And that's why the .gov.uk websites kind of built up the way that they did, is because if you are using raw HTML and raw CSS, you can take advantage of all the features that are in there, and you have to know what you're doing. I want to close with a thought experiment. Imagine that all of the humans in the world tomorrow were turned into perfect spheres, and we had to travel around everywhere by rolling. This immediately means, even if we have our own power, we cannot get into the vast majority of cars. Only some public transport will be accessible to us. There's a decent chunk of office buildings that we won't be able to get into. And there is a decent chunk of the web that, as a perfect sphere, we would not be able to interact with. If we don't have hands to deal with keyboards or mice, then we're going to have to do things like train voice activation software. And fundamentally, what upstream accessibility is actually about is the concept of removing limitations. This means that if you want to understand how to design things really well, whether you be someone trying to upstream accessibility fixes or a maintainer accepting upstream accessibility fixes, you've got to think like you're not who you are. You've got to think about what people would do in different scenarios, and in some cases, it can be really instructive to look at the bizarre, to look at situations like, what if every human tomorrow was turned into a perfect sphere? Because once you start thinking about the bizarre and designing for the bizarre, you'll get really good at thinking about humans and designing for humans rather than just designing for yourself. I would not have been able to give this talk without the wisdom and expertise of others. Specifically, I want to call out the 3 people that I named over the last 45 minutes. Sherry Bernhaber for all of her body of work, but for her excellent blog post about how not to be an accessibility Grinch. Jess Budd for the stimulating conversation that we had at DDD Adelaide in 2019, and for being willing to understand my view and also challenge it and change it. And Katie Mack for the many conversations that we've had about accessibility, and for somehow always giving me the perfect scenario to illustrate the point that I've had in my head that I didn't know needed to go in the talk. I'm assuming that I have been answering questions throughout the course of the talk, but if you do have more questions, I will be around later to answer them, or you can contact me on the information that's up on the slide. Hopefully this talk has given you a good roadmap to upstream accessibility improvements that you want to see. And if you're a maintainer, hopefully it's given you a good roadmap to understand what you need to do to keep your project accessible rather than just making it accessible at a point in time.